Hey guys, welcome back. I know it's been a minute, and as you can see, I'm finally in my new place. So I think it's about time that we get back into the swing of things around here. And I don't think there's a better way to do that than with a few games from my favorite genre. That's right, we're gonna look at 3 beat-em-ups that, for various reasons, never quite made it into the regular rotation for most people. These either got overlooked and came out at the wrong time, or were just weird enough that they didn't find an audience anywhere. So let's start with one that almost no one saw coming, because literally no one ever saw it. Alright, first up, let's talk about a game that I think a lot of people kind of slept on, and honestly I can't really blame them. Captain Commando hit the Super Nintendo back in 1995, which is a port of their arcade game of the same name. And if you were a kid with a Super Nintendo back in the mid-90s, there's a decent chance that you never even saw this one on the shelf, and we'll get into why in just a second. But if you did happen to see this one at your local video store and you could get past some of Capcom's worst box art since Mega Man, you would have probably had an okay time with this one. So first, a little context. As mentioned, Captain Commando actually started life as an arcade game back in 1991. The same year, a little game called Street Fighter II came out as well, a game that was about to transform arcades for the next decade. And to be fair, I don't think anyone knew just how big Street Fighter II was about to be. In the meantime though, Captain Commando came out with the same wave of Capcom brawlers that was doing the rounds around that time, like King of Dragons and Knights of the Round. Except instead of going the whole gang warfare or fantasy route, this one leaned really hard into comic book territory, a really weird comic book. Unsurprisingly, Captain Commando just never hit it big in the arcades for obvious reasons. It didn't even do as well as the other beat-em-ups that I just mentioned. But Capcom loved to bring their lesser-known arcade games to the Super Nintendo. Here's the thing though, the game didn't actually make it to the Super Nintendo until 1995, 4 years after the arcade version. And by that point, the Super Nintendo was basically heading into its twilight years. Beat-em-ups in general had already kind of cooled off just due to oversaturation. So this thing just didn't ever get a lot of attention anywhere, arcade or Super Nintendo. Gameplay-wise, this is basically just your classic Capcom brawler. You get an attack button, a jump button, and each character has their own super move as well. But what makes this one stand out over the rest of an ocean of similar games is just how weird all the characters you can play as are. The most normal of the bunch is Captain Commando himself, who comes equipped with energy gloves that let you electrify floors if too many enemies are around. You also get Ginzu the Ninja, who mostly just kinda does ninja stuff. But then things start taking a really hard turn with Mac the Knife, who is, what I can gather, is just an alien who looks like a mummy and fights with knives. And last but certainly not least, you get Babyhead, which is a baby piloting a mech suit just because Capcom was definitely on some shit back in the early 90s. And overall, the rest of the game is just as wacky, with stages set in a circus tent deathmatch, a museum where you're fighting cavemen, and then racing across the river on a surfboard trying to catch a mad scientist. And this is just the stuff that I miss in games like this. The game obviously isn't trying to take itself seriously. It's just a fun, silly beat-em-up that's more concerned with giving you a bunch of crazy stages to beat dudes up in than anything else. There's a total of 9 of them though, which sounds like it could be a slog to get through, but most of them are actually pretty short, so you're just breezing through a lot of this game, and that is not a bad thing. The game's biggest problem though is that this version of the game just feels a little not up to Capcom standards, because the Super Nintendo version is not the full arcade experience, and if you're the type of person who cares about that kind of thing, you're gonna notice here. The arcade original supported up to 4 players at once, but the Super Nintendo version is understandably cut down to 2 players, but it gets worse from there. There's way less enemies on the screen at any given time, and the graphics and animations got trimmed way back here. It just kinda looks dingy and muted compared to the arcade's way more colorful look. And this is probably a big one for fans of the original. The rideable mechs that you could hop into in the arcade game have been completely removed here, even though on the back of the box it's listed as one of the game's bullet points. And overall, the game just kind of feels slower and more sluggish compared to the arcade game, and that's usually not the kind of product that Capcom would deliver on the Super Nintendo. But even when Capcom is just phoning something in, it's still a pretty good Super Nintendo game, and judged on its own terms, it's okay. But going by all of that, is Captain Commando for the Super Nintendo still worth your time today? Well, I mean, if you grew up with it, then absolutely, sure. There's still some real charm here. But if you're coming into this fresh with no nostalgia attached at all, I don't think it's going to do much to impress you, especially on the Super Nintendo. And since that original Super Nintendo cartridge is gonna be pretty pricey to track down these days, you should probably just play the original arcade version on the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle. And that's probably the definitive way to play it these days. Plus, you get a bunch of other fun brawlers to play that defined that whole era, at least until Street Fighter II came in and blew everything up. Either way though, Captain Commando deserves a bit more love than it's gotten over the years. It's a weird, mostly forgotten relic of Capcom's early 90s beat-em-up craze. Next up, let's talk about a game where you play as what appears to be a Dollar General version of Indiana Jones, along with a few other vaguely 80s action hero looking guys, with your job being to punch evil animal poachers in the face to save endangered wildlife, with rocket launchers. This is Growl, and this one's made by Taito and came out on the Genesis back in 1991, and I'm pretty confident most of you have never even heard of it, which is both a shame and probably for the best. It's a really weird game, but this is one of those weird beat-em-ups where I don't think its overall weirdo credibility can save it, at least the Genesis version. Growl, of course, started out as an arcade game in 1990 from Taito, the same folks behind Space Invaders, Bubble Bobble, and a bunch of other arcade classics from the time. In Japan, it was called Run Arc, but over here, we got the title of Growl, which is a pretty cool name, IMO. The arcade version is actually a lot of fun. Up to 4 players could beat poachers to death all you wanted, and the action was actually pretty wild. While most games like this were just content to throw 3 or 4 dudes on the screen at any given time, Growl was tossing out like a dozen at a time. It's actually kind of crazy to see this many enemies coming at you in a beat 'em up. It also had this genuinely unusual premise at the heart of it. You play as a PAWS agent, which stands for Protectors of Animals World Society, and you're here to absolutely destroy anyone that's messing with the local wildlife. And for the better or worse, the game leaned really hard into that theme, ending up with what looks like an over-the-top 80s action flick centered around saving baby elephants and other wildlife. And I'm spending a lot of time on the arcade version because I want you to know that that version is a lot of fun. It's fast-paced, chaotic, and it's absolutely hilarious. The Genesis port, though, well, it came out in 1991, and right out of the gate, it made one decision that hurt it more than almost anything else. The 4-player co-op mode is completely gone. Again, that's understandable. Not too many games came out with 4-player co-op anything back then. But they didn't even give you 2-player simultaneous play here. That's right, this is a single-player only beat-em-up for a genre that lives and dies on couch co-op, and unfortunately, that ain't the only bad thing about it. While the arcade version of Growl features some fairly solid action, the Genesis version just feels not great. It still has a ton of enemies on screen at times, but the act of actually hitting any of them feels awful. There's nothing that makes you feel like you're connecting any attacks unless the guy just kind of falls backwards or something. It feels like you're swinging at air most of the time, and thanks to the multitude of dudes constantly surrounding you at any given time, it's really easy to get locked in place with no way to fight back. At least the game still gives you the crazy amount of pickups from the arcade game. The arsenal in this game is just absurd for what you usually get in one of these kinds of games. You've got your melee stuff like pipes, swords, a whip, which is the best weapon in the game by the way, but then you can also pick up stuff like pistols, rifles, rocket launchers, and grenades. You can even beat people up with the guns when you run out of ammo. So even if punching guys feels totally lame in this version, there's usually at least something scattered around on the ground to try and make up for it. The other big hook in the game are the animals. As you move through each stage, you'll come across captured wildlife. If you free them, they'll fight alongside you for a minute. Eagles will swoop down and attack enemies, deer stampede through the screen, and if you're lucky enough to rescue an elephant, it will absolutely trample everything in its path. This is probably the coolest gimmick in the whole game, and I just wish it was used more, because the game desperately needs the action broken up more often. Besides that though, there's not really much else going on here. There's usually a good amount of stuff to interact with in the stages, and that would be great if the Genesis port didn't also slow down the attack speed compared to the arcade, which means you're trading hits with enemies way more than you'd actually want to. It's just so slow compared to the arcade, and without a friend playing next to you, it really drags. Oh, and before I forget it, the Genesis version also removed a really awful platforming section in a cave that was in the arcade, and replaced it with an equally awful cave level where you can't see shit. So definitely choose your poison with that one. So what are we left with here? Well, the Genesis port is thinner than the arcade version in basically every single way, and playing it solo in 2026, you are going to feel the repetition. But is it worth experiencing? Well, I mean, yeah, for the right person. If you like games that tried something different, Growl has a lot of that going on. The animal rescue gimmick is neat in a way that still holds up today, at least with how funny it is. The weapons are ridiculous and there's tons of them, and just the overall setting and theme of the game is really unique. I mean, how many other games out there can you name where you're rescuing animals from poachers that are controlled by an alien? Oh, did I forget to mention that part? Oh, well, there you go. It's one of those games that I think is way more fun to talk about and show people than it is to sit down and grind through it alone for an hour or so. Show someone the elephant stampede and maybe the alien exploding out of the last boss, and you've pretty much got the full Growl experience. Or just play the arcade version because that one is legit fun. But fair warning though, the original Genesis carts are very expensive these days since it was a limited release. The arcade version though is available on Taito Legends 2, and that is the way to go if you want the fuller experience complete with co-op. Overall though, I mean, Growl's still a weird little footnote in Genesis history, and I'm one of those weird people that can fully appreciate that. And lastly, let's talk about a game where you play as a regular guy. You've already survived 2 absolutely nightmarish encounters with supernatural evil, but you've escaped, you've saved your girlfriend, and you put the whole thing behind you. You got married, had a kid, bought a mansion in Connecticut, and got into finance. And yes, that's actually part of the story. You were done with all that monster stuff. But then, wouldn't you know it, the monsters show up at your house. And that's Splatterhouse 3 in a nutshell. This is one of those games that I think a lot of Genesis owners remember fondly, but has mostly been kind of forgotten over the years. But first, for the few of you that somehow don't know what this series even is, Splatterhouse blew up as an arcade game in 1988 from Namco, and the whole premise was basically an 80s slasher movie in video game form. Splatterhouse. But instead of running from the monsters, you are the monster. Sorta. You play as Rick, a college student who puts on a very familiar looking hockey mask that takes control of you so that you can absolutely destroy the army of the undead that's standing in your way to save your girlfriend Jennifer. It was actually pretty crazy for the time for just how over the top and gory it was, because not too many games were doing this kind of thing back then. The first home version landed on the TurboGrafx 16, to the excitement of the 7 or so people that actually owned the TurboGrafx. The second game came out of the Genesis, which gave Namco a lot more freedom to just be themselves. Sega at the time had this whole "we're the edgy one" thing going on for the Genesis, so the gloves just really came off on the gore front, ending up with a game that's actually still pretty gross even by today's standards. By the time Splatterhouse 3 came out in 1993, the series had built up a pretty decent cult following, and this third entry was clearly Namco trying to do something a little bit more ambitious. It was one of the first games that actually received Sega's MA13 rating, their version of a mature content warning before the ESRB existed. So even by the standards of the day, this game was already pushing things. And as soon as you start playing Splatterhouse 3, things get pretty interesting, because it's not just a side-scroller like the first 2 games. The whole thing takes place inside Rick's mansion, and each level is a floor of the house. You get a map and you plot your way through each room to make it to the boss. There are dead ends, branching paths, shortcuts. The whole mansion's got this maze-like quality to it all that felt pretty unique for a brawler back in 1993. But you can't just explore at your own pace. As the intro to the game says, you can't just wander, I think it actually means wander, around the house since there's actually a time limit. Each floor has a clock counting down, and whether you make it to the boss in time directly affects the story and how you progress through the game. If you run out of time, then bad things are going to happen to your family. Jennifer can just straight up die in stage 2. Your son David can also be taken as well. And knowing that the clock is always running actually adds some real tension to what would otherwise be a pretty standard punch everything experience. But sometimes that timer doesn't tell you everything, and stage 2 is where it gets nasty. There's a hidden deadline inside the stated deadline. Jennifer is effectively beyond saving once the clock hits 2 minutes, not 0. You need to already be in the boss room before it hits that mark. Most players won't know this on a first run. Hell, I didn't even know this for years after the fact. The game doesn't tell you at all. On top of that, clearing a stage fast enough can actually change which stage you play next. The timer's so baked into the story logic that your pace through each floor shifts the entire path that you take. It's a pretty cool idea, but I just wish there was a little better explanation for what times you need to hit to get to where you need to go. Because if you don't know what you're doing, it just kind of seems like it happens at random. As for actually playing it, Rick himself feels a lot better than the earlier games. He's got actual combos this time, along with the spin kick that takes some practice to pull off, but becomes essential if you want to hit those required times. And also the ability to transform into a bigger, meatier version of himself once you collect power orbs. Monster Rick hits harder, takes less damage, and replaces his spin kick with meat sticks that shoots out of his torso. It's also really hard. The enemies can take you down pretty fast, and the bosses in particular are the kind that makes you put the controller down and just stare at the wall for a few minutes before you try again. But the biggest enemy by far in the game is the time limit, since you just cannot screw around for too long if you want to get out before it hits 0. It never really feels unfair, but it's definitely the kind of game where you feel like you're getting better each time you start over, and you will be starting over. But besides the gameplay, what makes Splatterhouse 3 feel different from basically everything on the Genesis is the atmosphere. This game fully commits to its horror theme. The story is told through digitized cutscenes between levels and even during the levels. Real actors, real costumes, and a really creepy presentation for what it actually is. It gives the whole thing this cheesy but effective tone that feels exactly like an 80s horror movie, which is absolutely the point. The monsters range from headless zombies and weird, giant, fleshy fetus-looking things to stuff like a teddy bear boss that has a monster inside of it that just kind of looks like it was made from a bunch of meat and claws. And I always really love the boar worm boss that just looks gross on its own, but then it bursts open with a bunch of maggots when its health gets too low. And I mean, for the time, this was some pretty gross stuff. The story itself is also better than you'd expect from a game like this. Rick and Jennifer's relationship has actual weight to it by this point. You're not just punching monsters for the hell of it here, you're trying to save your family. And the ending, if you can make it that far, has a pretty dark twist involving the Terror Mask that I'm not gonna be spoiling here. But is it worth playing these days to see that ending? Well, I mean, yeah, it's actually still pretty cool. It's not winning any awards, the combat's repetitive, the time limit is just brutal, and it can be pretty frustrating. But as a package, it holds up better than a lot of other beat-em-ups from the time. The open exploration of the mansion, the weird timer stuff, the multiple endings and ways to get through the mansion, there's more going on here than you'd think from a game called Splatterhouse. But just like all the games in today's video, this one gets pretty expensive if you want that cartridge. And sadly, there really isn't a convenient way to play it these days, with its only real re-release being available as an unlockable in the 2010 Splatterhouse reboot for the Xbox 360 and PS3. And that kinda sucks, because Splatterhouse 3 deserves to be played more. It's weird and dark and surprisingly thoughtful for a game that started out as just an excuse to let players run around in a Jason mask and kill monsters with a 2x4. This one's actually pretty good stuff, folks. Check it out if you haven't. So there you go. 3 beat-em-ups from the 16-bit era that just never quite got their moment. And while none of these are Game of the Year contenders, what I love about all 3 of them is that they were at least trying to do something a little bit different, not just fill shelf space. Captain Commando had personality to burn. Splatterhouse 3 had a timer that actually made you care about fictional people in a brawler, which should not be possible. And Growl, Growl's mostly just a big old mess, but it's so damn weird that I can't help but like it. But I think that's gonna do it for me this week, kiddos. If you like this video, then do me a favor and tell YouTube that by clicking that like button. And if this video seems like your kind of thing, then we got a whole lot more if you click that subscribe button. So check back next week for whatever else weird stuff I dig up around here. But as always, thanks for watching.